Hello, everybody. Hello. Thank you for coming in today. My name is Lauren Lee. I'm the current chair of the Graduate Student Committee of the Medieval Academy of America, and I've co-organized this with Camilla Marconi, who was going to kick us off with some welcome comments. So go ahead, Camilla.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Lauren. Let's just get started. Thank you to everyone for joining us this afternoon or morning or night, wherever you might be joining us from. Today's webinar, Writing Against the Clock, Finding Joy in Our Writing Practice, is the Graduate Student Committee's last webinar of this academic year, but we look forward to continuing to offer our graduate student community of medievalists, Medievalists Plus, more opportunities to get together and to think about how we can build sustainable writing and research practices. For example, part 2 of this webinar, which is going to happen next week, it's February 18th from 2 to 3:30 p.m. It's going to be an open workshop style, just open writing hour. Please do register for that if you haven't already. It is a different link because that'll be a regular Zoom meeting, not webinar style. Through this series, we really aim to reject the scarcity mindset of phrases like publish or perish that we've all heard or may have heard in our academic lives, by number one, speaking with writers like our panelists who offer a clear alternative vision for what academic writing can be, and number two, by writing together. So please do join us. Has that link been shared in the chat? No, I can drop it in the chat. Or Lauren's got it. Okay, thank you, Lauren. And then just also as a reminder, all of our virtual webinars are available for later viewing on the MA's YouTube page. So if you miss anything today or would like refreshers on some of our past webinars, which have covered topics like grant writing, podcasting, and getting the most out of your archival research, you can watch those on your own time at your leisure. And we'll share that in the chat as well. I'm going to kick it back to Lauren for a moment to spotlight some other GSC happenings. And also to say thank you to Lauren for being a wonderful chair and coming to all of these events, making sure they happen.
Oh my gosh, thank you, Camilla. Well, we're just gonna fangirl back and forth because this event is really Camilla's brainchild. But thank you so much, and please be sure to join us all as well this coming conference season for our many GSC sponsored sessions and social events that will take place at the upcoming annual meeting of the Medieval Academy of America in March. And at the ICMS in Kalamazoo in May, and at the IMC at Leeds this July. We have events happening at all three of those conferences. But whether you're attending those conferences in person or remotely, you may also benefit from taking part in the GSC's regularly occurring mentoring program, which helps students establish professional contacts with scholars who can offer them career advice and opportunities to expand their professional networks. To take part in this mentoring program, you, as either a mentor or a mentee, we're always looking for more mentors in particular. You can fill out the sign up form available on our committee's webpage, but I've also just put that sign up form in the chat. And finally, we'd like to encourage you to get in contact with us with any of your ideas, your wants, your needs. And if you feel like we're missing something, either good or bad, we'd really like to know that. So our purpose is to act on behalf of the graduate student members of the Academy and to address your concerns, to promote your work, and to offer opportunities for growth. So please do stay in touch. You can contact us directly via our email, which I will also place in the chat. Our email account is gsc@themedievalacademy.org. And you can also stay in the know with all of our current goings on via our triannual newsletter and through our various social media accounts, which now include our brand new Blue Sky. So find us on Blue Sky. Now for a rundown of today's workshop, I'm going to send it back to Camilla.
Thanks, Lauren. Okay, no time to waste. So let's get going. We're going to start with just short prepared remarks from each one of our panelists in the order that they appeared on the promotional material. That's just alphabetical by last name. And then we'll move on to 10 minutes or so of interpanelist conversation. And I really want to encourage you guys to ask questions of each other, to ask for clarification, pull out common threads, or to even disagree. And we'll wrap up with 10 minutes or so of audience questions. But please do feel free to start asking your questions at any point during the webinar. You can use the lovely Q&A feature, and we'll see how it's going. If you put one in the chat, we'll probably find it there as well. So without further ado, let's get into it. We'll start with Irina Dumitrescu. Irina is a writer, literary critic, and professor of English and Medieval Studies at the University of Bonn. She is the author of The Experience of Education in Anglo-Saxon Literature, a study of the productive role played by difficult emotions in teaching and learning. Just sort of relatable subject. A specialist in Old and Middle English, she is currently working on a monograph about the medieval roots of celebrity. She writes for the Times Literary Supplement, and her writing has been nominated for the Pushcart Prize, shortlisted for the James Beard Foundation's MFK Fisher Distinguished Writing Award, and received the McGinnis Ritchie Award for Nonfiction. Thank you so much, Irina.
Thank you, Camila. And I should say I'm on a slightly iffy connection. If things go badly, just let me know and I'll pop out and pop back in maybe and let someone else speak for a while. I was asked to talk about joy in writing practice, but also a number of other things. And I thought, how might I do this succinctly? So I'm going to say three things. So two ideas and a little story. Idea number one is, I think, one of, I'm going to say, problems with academia is that it hyper trains the critical muscle. If you train the biceps, you should do the triceps too. And I think if we train the analytical and critical, we should also train the creative, but we don't. What academia in every country that I've worked in does is hyper train criticism, the critical muscle, to the extent that you can't even write without imagining what reader B would say, or what what all the potential criticisms could be. And that's a very difficult place to write from, to write anything from. It's hard to write in fear. It's a very anxious position. I tend to think of it, I come across this in my public writing classes, because a lot of academics, I think, use very dense jargon and difficult sentences because they're afraid of being understood. Because if someone understood them, they might find the flaws in their argument. And I think of it as a kind of citadel type writing. It doesn't matter if no one enjoys it, but as long as no one can penetrate through, you're safe. Whereas the writing that I've been striving to do more and more of in my career is what I think of as garden writing, which means people can come through, they can have a pleasurable time, they can find their own path through the work, and they might piss on your roses. That might be something that happens, but it's part of the risk involved in meeting people and leaving a few gaps, for example, in being a little simpler and leaving out a few adverbs. But I think the problem is that the fear can really lead to a lot of writer's block, and it's just not a good place to be for an entire career. And so the trick is in finding ways to overcome the fear, at least for a while. And one way to do that is just to divide the drafting from the critical analysis or the editing, which is what a lot of creative writers do, is just focus on drafting, put the work away, and then focus on editing. But that takes a lot of practice. The other problem, which sort of was touched on in the questions that we received, was the problem of time. And I think this is something that everybody deals with. The first perverse thing is that the longer you go on in your career, the less time you have. And I hate to say this, but I wish I had the time I had in graduate school. It didn't feel like a lot of time back then, but now it feels like amazing amounts of time, partly because of work and partly because of care commitments and other things that come up. Our backs need, physiotherapy once a week, that takes out writing time. And the other perverse thing is that the longer you go on in your career, if you're fortunate enough to continue writing, nobody cares about whether you do your writing but you. Maybe at the your dissertation, or your colleagues care if you get tenure, if you're fortunate enough. But as you go on, it really becomes for you. If it might be for promotion, but that might not even be in play. there's not a lot to be won except your own satisfaction at some point. Potential ego gratification, but even that is not guaranteed. So you wind up in a situation where you have to take time from people who want your time, your children and parents and spouses and students and colleagues and deans and people like that, and use it for something that's only important to you. And I think that's a very difficult thing. That's also, in a way, that's why it's important to do it for many of us. If we're used to putting other people first, it's important to sort of to learn how to do that. But it is hard to steal away that time when it really does feel like it's being stolen from other responsibilities and other duties. That said, I also do think that it's very much possible, even with quite a full schedule, to make time to write. I've heard lots of people saying, I don't have time to write, or I can't do it. And sometimes I know they have less time than I do. So I don't think I don't like the word discipline, but I think it's a matter of finding the tricks and finding the ways to integrate it into a regular day that's important, or some kind of regular schedule. We could talk about that some more later, but again, I was only given 5 minutes, so I want to stick close to time. I was also asked to talk about a time when writing brought me joy. And the thing that occurred to me happened a week and a half ago, which I will talk about, and this is a little bit personal. I had been sitting on an essay that I was blocked on for about 2.5 years. I had written half of it. I got COVID for the first time, and then I got completely blocked. And it was for my favorite and most prestigious and best paying publication. And I felt terribly, terribly ashamed. And it felt like it was a block, like a big block. I was writing other things, but this felt like it was just in the way. Part of the problem was I had to say something I didn't really want to put on paper, but I couldn't write the essay without saying something uncomfortable about another person's book. And at the same time, for more years than I care to mention, I've been working on a book proposal, and it's been the most consistent and various experience of failure I've had in my life. It's come to a place where I really was just doing the book proposal for me, so that I knew I wouldn't stop writing book proposals, but I've had every kind of bad luck and failure that you could imagine in this process. So I decided in my head somewhere that this essay was keeping me from kind of making progress with the book. And in December, when I was sick, I used the sick time to finish the essay. And I sent it to the editor and I said, it doesn't matter if you use it or not. I know it's late. Here it is. And then I set to finishing the book proposal, number 19 or whatever. And the final proofs for that essay came in as I was finishing the final paragraph of the sample chapter of the book proposal. I had stolen weeks of time from my family. I was in my office late at night, and I'm getting these emails back and forth from this editor asking about these little words on various lines. And I'm rewriting the final paragraph of my book proposal. And I finished them at the same time. And I just burst into tears. I was so happy. I was also happy that I now keep Irish whiskey in my office, because I had 2 glasses of that and then had some Chinese food. And I think it was the fact that the writing made me happy. I had just done this completely irrational thing, none of it made any sense. None of it was guaranteed to pay off. And somehow I had still stuck with it. And it was worth it to learn that about myself, that I could do this nonsensical thing, because I just hated the idea of quitting more. And I have to say that was a very, very, very joyful evening. And I was slightly tipsy by the time I got home, but I'm still kind of teary even thinking about it, about just how wonderful it was to finish both of these pieces at the same time. Yeah.
Oh, that's glorious. I love hearing that. I'm already full of questions to ask you later, Irina. Thank you so much for that. We're gonna pivot now to Bruce. I'm so excited Bruce could be here. He's at my own university, at the University of Virginia. He is the Lyndon Kent Memorial Professor of English at the University of Virginia and the editor of the journal New Literary History. His new book, The Parchment Inheritance, which I love, it explores the parchment record of the pre-modern world from a number of different angles: environmental history, theology, historical genetics, as well as the emerging field of biocodicology. Some of his previous books include The Pre-Modern Condition, Medievalism and the Making of Theory, as well as Neo-Medievalism, Conservatism, and The War on Terror. That was from 2007. These books have explored the shaping role of the medieval in the making of modern critical thought and political discourse. Holsinger is also an acclaimed fiction writer. His novel, A Burnable Book from 2014, won the John Hurt Fisher Prize and was selected as an editor's choice by the New York Times Book Review, and was named one of the top crime novels of 2014 by the American Library Association. The Invention of Fire, which was released in 2015, explores the beginnings of gun violence in the Western world. Both of these novels have been widely reviewed in publications such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Sunday Times of London. And his fiction writing has been featured several times on NPR. His third novel, The Gifted School, which was released in 2019, won the Colorado Book Award, and his latest novel, The Displacements from 2022, has been described in the New York Times as hypnotic and upsetting. So thank you so much for being here, Bruce. Please share your thoughts, writing, all things writing. How do you do it?
Great, absolutely. And Lauren and Camilla, thank you so much for inviting me. So everything I'm going to say is basically just a footnote to what my beloved colleague Irina just said, and especially about the relationship between the creative and critical muscles and exercising those in different ways. And what I wanted to talk about in terms of the joy of writing, finding joy in writing, comes from the relationship between those two parts of at least of my writing life, which for a long, long time were separate. I went along for many years while writing very very awkward, I think, academic prose for a long time with long, impenetrable sentences that I go back now and even I can hardly understand from my earlier academic writing. That was one side of my brain, and then writing fiction without publishing it for many years. Those were just two different parts of my my writing life and my writing soul, I suppose. And it's only been in the last 10 years that those two things have come together. And rather than describing what that's been like for me, I thought what I would do is, because I've been giving a number of workshops on creative critical writing to graduate programs actually over the last couple of years. And I've just from picking up on things that I've heard from writers in their early careers, I thought what I offer is just some ways that I think we can bring techniques of fiction writing, even if we're not fiction writers, into academic writing, into the kind of academic prose that we write. So, and how that, I guess the merging of technique, thinking harder about our technique and our craft, and joy, and how those two things can blend, and also how they can give us great ways of thinking about our time. I suppose that might be a corollary of this. So just a small hand list of things. So one is just simply creativity and flow. Sitting down and realizing that not all writing has to have an object. It doesn't have to have an aim. If you're stuck, if you're stressed, if you have a deadline that's way past, and I've had way past deadlines for the last 30 years, you can do a lot of good for yourself by getting off your computer, taking a notebook somewhere, cuddling up and just blathering on the page. I do that all the time, at least 2 or 3 times a week when I don't compose for the most part longhand, but I do detox longhand. And I think that can really, really help. That's just a very simple one that I think in getting off your computer, dedigitizing for a little bit. It's an obvious thing to say in our day and age, but I think the value of it is just immense for me. But also, okay, so another craft aspect of this is thinking about stronger narrative structures in your academic writing. That awful dissertation chapter that you're struggling with right now and just thinking, what the hell is this even about? What am I writing about? And if you start thinking of every chapter, every dissertation chapter, every essay that you want to publish as a kind of storytelling, just like you'd find in a short story or a novel, you can start to understand aspects of your work. I think it helps reflect back on what the object of our inquiry is. You can think about the manuscript that you're writing about as a hero in some way, as a character whose story you want to tell. You can think about agonism or conflict in what you're writing about, not just between characters, but between dimensions of a cultural moment that you're writing about. One advantage of that, when I start to think about that in my own academic writing, it also helps us get distance on ourselves a little bit. Because one of the problems that I often see in academic writing, and I edit a journal and have a book series editor. I teach a lot of graduate seminars, is that we, and I include myself here, like to write in the first person often. And I don't mean in more confessional autobiographical writing where it belongs, self-critical writing. I mean just when we're talking about a manuscript. And people will often lapse into that third person plural or first person when and what that key and talking about our method for reading or and I could give more specific examples of this in the Q&A, but it tends to distance us from the matter that we love and that we find wonder in, which is the stuff that we're writing about, right? The stuff from the medieval world for this audience. And I think getting putting those people, making them the subjects of your verbs, a line, a stanza, a poet, a manuscript, rather than us as the subject, these we modern humans, I think can help in that storytelling impulse. I think this also can help with emotional engagement, instead of what Irina was describing, the kind of dryly, overcritically infused academic prose, just understanding what, the emotion there. Another aspect of this is description. So I'm teaching the PhD prospectus seminar right now in our department, and I keep telling the students in there, they're all writing their prospectuses, getting ready to present them to their committees, and I keep telling them, look, you can pause for a page and just describe the thing that you're talking about. All right. The art of description in academic writing, I think, is often a lost art. And there's nothing wrong with just sitting down for a little bit. You don't have to be making a critical argument. You don't even have to be making a creative intervention. Just describe what's there, what's in front of you. My own dissertation director would often say, just tell us what's there, right? What's in front of you. Now, hermeneutics of suspicion, blah, 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 surface reading versus depth, all of that is there. But I think there's a real virtue in just being able to describe what's in front of you, whether it's an art object, a stanza, and so on, a manuscript. I think economy of language is a big one here. My fiction editors are always telling me to cut 5,000 words, 10,000 words, in one case, 30,000 words from a manuscript. And I think that academics could use a lot more of that. Less is more. Finally, I think this thinking about the creative fiction writing world and how it can enter our academic prose, I think a confidence and experimentation and letting yourself, because there's a close relationship between form and style, I think, and experimenting more with forms in your chapters. Shorter chapters, little excursions between chapters where you're doing something new and a little bit wild. I think opening yourself to those kinds of creative impulses. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Bruce. That was wonderful. I like the manuscript as hero sort of device. We carrying that forward, maybe manuscript as enemy. Wanted to move on to introducing Julia Istamina as the Associate Director of the Yale Graduate Writing Lab within the Poorvu Center for Teaching and Learning. Julia manages workshops and writing groups programming, directs the Poorvu Public Communication Certificate Program, and also teaches on topics related to graduate research, writing, and public speaking. Her scholarship has appeared in the African American Review, Arizona Quarterly, a journal of American literature, culture, and theory, the West Africa Review, and Rattle. Her poetry has appeared in various venues, including the Antioch Review, Fence Magazine, Salt, the Pip Gertrude Stein Awards Anthology, and Jacket Magazine. She earned a PhD in English Literature from the Ohio State University, an MFA in Poetry from the New School Graduate Writing Program, and a BA from Kenyon College. She is excited about the late spring launch of her new podcast called The Write-In Graduate Student Narratives, which will feature stories from current and recent Yale graduate students talking about the challenges and victories that they experienced and the tools that they harnessed to write a doctoral thesis. We'll definitely be tuning into that. Another aspect of Julia's career that I hope to tune into is this workshop called Dissertation Writing as Practice. I hope that we could talk a little bit about that today, either in your opening salvo or in the Q&A. So I leave it now to Julia. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Camila and Lauren. Thank you for having me. I'm kind of in awe of my fellow panelists, but I will try to keep my imposter stress to at bay and at minimum. But yeah, I actually I found joy in writing something for this occasion, and it should be close to the 5-minute mark. But I'd love to read it for you, and it actually focuses more on the narrated experiences of my students for this dissertation writing as practice series. Although there's some touch points there that I kind of bring in terms of my own experience as a writer. So I'm just going to go for it. 15 minutes a day, whether it's Joan Bolker, Paul Sylvia, or James Clear, we've been taught that 15 minutes a day of an activity, writing, exercising, is the pathway to progress and not stalling. So why haven't we all been doing it since we got the memo, whether it's my graduate students or, most humbly, me? Why do we continue to stall out when we can just bite-size our writing into a dissertation or monograph? At Yale, I teach the Dissertation Writing as Practice series. This year, I incorporated reflective polls at the beginning of each session. The responses led me to theorize that finding pleasure and joy in writing is predicated on reaching a flow state. And can everyone hear me okay? I just want to make sure my volume's good. Okay, wonderful. Before I started asking about emotions, I decided to ask about flow state. I borrowed from psychology a definition of flow as a cognitive state where one is completely immersed in an activity. Flow involves intense focus, creative engagement, and the loss of awareness of time and self. Did you have a moment of flow last week when writing? And if so, describe the context. What, where, how? The yeses included, I was in my carrel in the library and had a few hours that I knew could totally be devoted to writing. About 45 minutes of it was a real flow state. I was working on a chapter outline and writing out some questions, and the sense of curiosity was really motivating. I did, writing a conference abstract at my desk. It was Friday evening, so I felt like all my other responsibilities were on the back burner for a bit, and I could just focus on the writing. I'm thinking of ways to replicate that state at other times of the week. The challenges included, I think I often get anxious when writing about how accurate I am being, about the time in the past I was not productive, and so on. I think these thoughts always get in the way of me getting into a flow state. And I had a moment of flow when I used a no distraction timer for a couple of hours, having 5-minute breaks twice in an hour. I think that what got in the way was emails that I needed to respond to for TFing. In her new book, Black Feminist Writing, A Practical Guide to Publishing Academic Books, Stephanie Evans writes about writing as a way of thinking, detailing in her preface how her own advisor, quote, modeled how to slow down enough to think, how to freeze time and be in the moment. At its best, she writes, writing is a way of thinking independent of external compulsion or reward. Is the goal then not to, quote unquote, write a lot, but how to set up your writing practice to achieve a flow state? Another poll asked, when have you experienced pleasure? Students wrote, whenever I had really big blocks of time to write, when I had more time and space to write and less pressure to have my structure and argument all together right away, and I felt capable and competent, like my accomplishments and findings were warranted. And lastly, I experience pleasure whenever I ride a thought current, hitting a really exciting thought or discovery and suddenly wanting to write about it nonstop. In the same poll, I asked, is pleasure different from joy in your writing process? I was curious about that question. Of course, we have Writing with Pleasure with Helen Sword. That was a big, I used your book in my workshop. So yeah, you'll cover your stuff. And a student wrote, I think so. It can be joyous to see a part of your argument crystallize, even if the process of getting the argument together was not full of pleasure nor pleasant. Joy seems to be more connected to purpose and meaning. I guess so. I suppose the feeling I just described, euphoria, is closer to joy, and then actual pleasure, a quieter feeling, comes from a good and inspired chunk of writing, completed and well done. Then I feel pleasure. The student responses show that flow state is vital to the set of conditions that could make writing pleasurable. They also show that we could probably explore more deeply how pleasure and joy differ in their meaning for writers. But even if we protect our time and space mindfully, negative thoughts can still creep in. To work with these challenges, we can reframe our writing not wholly about us, that it's about engaging with others. I quote Evans again. Time to think means reflecting on those who have come before, and alongside clocking our own thoughts, contextualizing our ideas in relation to others in the present and future. One of my students in the series, who is also a graduate writing lab consultant, Janya Moore, recommended Evans's book to me. At a time where my own schedule fluctuates minute to minute and imposter stress has bogged down my energy, by way of this book recommendation, my mentee became my mentor. Writing to share, not to compete, has opened a new way to think of flow state, states of grace, and pleasure and joy in my own writing process. Thank you for listening.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Writing to share and not to compete. I've been trying to adopt more of that, but easier said than done with the negative thoughts like you've highlighted. We'll be able to talk about that more in the Q&A. But for now, we will be turning to the last comments of our last, but certainly not least, of our panelists, Helen Sword. Helen Sword is a scholar, poet, and master teacher whose books on writing and writers include Stylish Academic Writing, The Writer's Diet, Air and Light and Time and Space, How Successful Academics Write, and Writing with Pleasure. She is a professor emeritus in the Center for Arts and Social Transformation at the University of Auckland, a fellow of the Royal Society of New Zealand, and the recipient of several major research and teaching awards. Helen has facilitated writing workshops at more than 100 universities, conferences, and research institutes on every continent except for Antarctica. There's still time. We can find one in Antarctica, I'm sure. Please see her website for links as well for writing resources, including books, workshops, retreats, videos, as well as other innovative editing tools, and WriteSpace, which is an international writing community with members in more than 30 countries. So without more preamble, Helen Sword, please share.
Well, it's lovely to be here, and I've got to say, having a late in the alphabet surname is sometimes a problem because these other three are quite an act to follow. I was scribbling down lots of notes, and really everything I want to say builds on what others have said. I don't think there's anything that I disagree with, really, and a whole lot that I completely agree with. So when have I recently written with pleasure? Well, I read a whole book called Writing with Pleasure. I would be lying if I said that every moment of writing the book was pleasurable. It was in some ways probably the hardest book I've written. But I read that book because in my previous book on How Successful Academics Write, where I interviewed and gathered questionnaire data from all these writers around the world, one of the questions I asked, kind of similar to Julia, was what are the main emotions that you associate with your academic writing? And in the workshops that I ran with graduate students and faculty, the number one most frequent emotion listed by a long shot was frustration, which is kind of an interesting one. And when I dug down into it, I actually wrote an article called Frustrated Academic Writers, just to try to drill down and figure out what was going on. And what was interesting there was that it included both the people who are frustrated because of being blocked, because of imposter syndrome, because of not finding the right words, because of academic constraints. But it also included those who really love to write and are frustrated because they can't find the time to do it. So it's actually a little skewed. But anxiety was the next most frequent emotion with that group. But I interviewed 100 so-called successful academic writers. I had some criteria for what that meant, but they were recommended to me by other people, various markers of success. I interviewed them, asked them the same question. Frustration was still the highest negative emotion, but above frustration were pleasure and joy. And that really struck me. So I thought, well, okay, so who's written about writing, the importance of bringing pleasure into your writing practice? Because these weren't people saying, oh, I love to write. It's so joyful. It's so fun and easy. They were saying, by and large, writing is hard, writing is frustrating, writing is challenging, and the joy is in the challenge. And I think that's a message that's really important for graduate students, because I think you can look around at other writers and think, everybody else finds it easy. I'm the only one who finds it hard. I promise you, just about everyone finds it hard. And yes, there's that maybe 1 out of 100 writers who is super prolific and says, oh yeah, the words just flow out, but they are incredibly rare. They're sort of the Tiger Woods of the writing world, right? For most of the people I interviewed who are highly successful writers, writing is slow, it's often painful, but it's joyful because of the challenge. So I wanted to see who's written about this, about the importance of finding pleasure in academic writing. And the answer was hardly anyone, maybe a little bit buried in a book here or there. So that was why I decided to write a whole book on writing with pleasure. And I'm really especially proud that it was published by Princeton University as part of their Skills for Scholars series, because that's basically Princeton saying that writing with pleasure is an important and useful academic skill. It's not just frou-frou. And we know this from behavioral psychologists. We know that if you do things that give you pleasure, you will be more productive in doing that thing because you want to do it. You run towards it rather than away from it. So it makes total sense that we should look for ways to amplify whatever pleasure we already feel in writing and to recover lost pleasures from childhood, from other modes of writing, if academe has driven or pounded, beaten them out of us, as is so often the case. So I wrote this book to try to find out all the different places where academics and ways in which academic writers find pleasure, and then just to lay them all out, basically, a kind of smorgasbord. And we all find pleasure in different things. So one person will find the greatest pleasure in a time when they had absolutely no constraints on their writing. And another will write about, and I actually had this, the time they're like locked in an exam room having to write a really difficult question, or in one case, having to write poetry in a foreign language under time constraints. And they say afterwards, it was amazing. It's sort of, I guess it's sort of like what Irina said about, best time in your life in retrospect, right? So some people get the pleasure from the pressure, others get it from the freedom. The key is to find what gives you pleasure and to really let that lead you. And I think all of the things that others have said about creativity as part of the bringing together creative and critical practices actually resonates with that, because creativity brings most of us joy. Our creative practices are the ones where we find flow, where we disappear into that sort of atemporal state because we're so completely absorbed. Again, not because it's easy, but because it's a creative challenge. So if I had to choose 4 things, I had 3, but I added another while I was taking notes. Things that you can do, things that very commonly give people joy in their writing, or pleasure in writing. A lot of people wrote about just the pleasure they get in ideas, in their research, in whatever drew them into academe in the first place. And I think it's really easy to lose sight of that. So that's a kind of abstract intellectual pleasure but it's a super important one. And a lot of people, when they wrote about a time in their lives when writing gave them pleasure, it was the first time they did a research project or the first time somebody really trusted them with something. For me, as somebody who's written several books about the craft of writing and who really cares about it, joy in the craft is another really important one. And again, it's finding that joy in the challenge. It doesn't mean it's easy. And in fact, for somebody like me, I'm an incredibly slow writer. I'm one of those perfectionists who just can't let a sentence go. And I go back to it and back to it. And that can be frustrating. I feel like I'm not moving forward and sometimes do have to do that thing, as Bruce suggested, sit down with a notebook and sort of let it loose. But the really big key turnaround for me was learning to see that as my superpower, not my weakness, learning not to beat myself up for being a meticulous craftsperson, but to honor that and to recognize that the time I put in at the front end, writing the right sentence, somebody else is putting in later on because they've sent something off in more drafty state, and then they have to go back and do lots of revisions. So honoring the craft and taking pleasure in the craft, and that makes you then want to learn the craft and put that time in to really figure out how to, and that includes bringing in techniques from fiction and creative nonfiction. And along with Julia, I'm going to put my hand up here for poetry. There's a lot of poetic thinking and thinking around metaphor that we can bring into our academic writing in ways that are pleasurable not only for us, but for our reader, that connect with our reader. So joy in ideas, joy in the craft, and several people have mentioned joy in materiality, in material practice. And that was really my biggest change, I think, in my practice after writing that book, was honoring the love of color and crafting that have been part of my life forever, but that I always saw as kind of not what academics do. And now, having talked to so many people and gathered so much material from people about how they use color, writing by hand, notebooks, all those things as part of their practice. It's a way of bringing in pleasure. It's a way of feeding your brain kind of in different ways. And it's a way of releasing the blocks and all those things people have talked about. I'm now into making my own notebooks. And so I don't just have one notebook now. At the moment, I have one for meetings, one for messy drafts, one for just sort of ideas, and then the one called notes is sort of my things to do and things like that. Sort of my way of breaking up a bullet journal into these individual things that I can carry around. And if you go to my website at helensword.com on Valentine's Day, which is the 4th anniversary of my Write Space community, I've got an all-day sort of Valentine's Day thing, and I'm going to give away 50 handmade notebooks and mail them anywhere in the world. And it's a ridiculous thing to be doing, but it gives me so much pleasure even to think about all of my handmade notebooks going out around the world. And that brings me then to the one more source of pleasure in writing, or one more way of building the pleasure in writing, which several people have mentioned, I think everybody has mentioned, which is other people, our connections with other people. And I was trained as a humanist. I come out of comparative literature. I wrote my dissertation deep in the bowels of the library in a carrel with no windows. That was what I thought academics did. And it was a real game changer for me to start to think more like a social scientist or scientist who actually sees other people not as rivals, but as colleagues. And even if I'm working on something that's sole authored, I'm much more likely now to talk to other people about it and to try to support them in their writing as well. So inviting them to share and not to compare. I love that phrase. So I'll end there because I'm really excited to hear questions and hear what others have to say.
Thank you so much, Helen. Those journals are beautiful and validates my like extensive gel pen collection. So this
Exactly.
is great.
See it as it's an intellectual activity. It's something that you're bringing to your writing to make yourself smarter and to make your work better. And for so many years, I thought, oh no, this is, the 6-year-old in me,
Mhm.
silly, playful,
And or this is a time waster, this is a procrastination, or because I want to put it in all beautiful colors instead of just somehow making
I
words appear on
think
the
through
page.
color. I think with color and using highlighters and colored pencils and things like that. I've done it all my life, and being able to accept that as an intellectual practice has been really important and educating.
Yeah. Yes, I think we've got a hand from Irina, and I just want to say that we're going to collapse the distinction between interpanelist and Q&A conversation for the sake of time. Please drop things in the Q&A, but Irina, let's kick it off with you.
Thank you. I wanted to underscore play, and I realized I didn't offer really any advice, any productive advice. One of them is to play in all sorts of ways, but I think the best advice I've ever come across, and that I pass on, is to have a kind of playfully experimental approach to your own intellectual and creative practice, which means constantly be figuring out what a particular project needs, what's available, what works at a particular time, because that also changes depending on the season or, other commitments. And just constantly trying different techniques, whether it's, like a free write to warm up at the beginning of a writing session, meditation can work, writing with other people works wonderfully, going for a walk. I have a Substack and I have a whole list of these, but I think the point is, um, it's a really good idea just to keep cycling through these and trying out new things, and sometimes trying out the old things and remembering that they worked. And I think one of the beautiful things about devoting time to writing is that then you get to know yourself in that way, right? You get to know how your own mind works, and when it's helpful to jump in the shower after writing. I sometimes write dirty, write dirty in the morning, and then go into the shower and like work out something in the shower and then go back to my computer. So I think that's what I would sort of give as the big advice, is just be constantly trying new techniques and strategies, and kind of keeping track of what has worked in the past, so that when you hit a block or a difficult period, you could start to work through them, and something then will often help.
I'll say something about the almost on the other end of the creative spectrum from that. Um, and that is when you're stuck. Imagine you're in the middle of a dissertation chapter right now, right? Or you're trying to figure out how to turn a chapter into a book or whatever, and you're just staring at this blank page. You don't know where to begin. You don't know where to go. One thing you probably do know is at least 5 or 6 passages from the medieval work that you're going to be talking about, right? And your goal is, let's say, 500 words a day. If you type those passages into the blank document, you'll probably have like 400 words, and you'll almost be there in your daily goal. That is like the most mechanical, automatic way of writing. But a lot of writing, as it's just a cliche by this point. A lot of writing is just typing and typing out those things. And then what you can also do is drop a footnote and put in the full bibliographical information for the edition of that work that you're using. You've got another 50 words there, right? So just using those kinds of exercises to build up the number of words in your document, so you're not despairing, so you're actually doing something. I still do that now when I'm like, I've got a piece that I'm really trying to work on for a Festschrift, and I'm kind of stuck. So one thing I did just the other day was start on my works cited page. I had nothing else in my head that I could do that day, but even that is getting something done. And I found joy in completing it. I really did. And I've dropped this link in the chat to this book called How We Write, 13 Ways of Looking at a Blank Page, edited by Suzanne Akbari. And it's got mostly medievalists in it, but a bunch of people talking about ways that they negotiate the writing process and find joy in it, find challenges, move around those challenges, and so on.
Can I just add, I think besides, I love that. Just get something in there, somebody else's quote. But another way of thinking about these goals that Julia talked about as well, you know, how kind of intimidating they can be. I often advise people to just touch their writing every day. So that can be in that spirit of playfulness that Irina's talking about. It can be going for a walk and just thinking about what you're excited about working on right now. It can be, I'm with you. For me, it's the bath, not the shower, but the ideas that come when you're in water or, you know, someplace other than in front of the computer, and then having strategies for just kind of capturing some of that. But touching your writing every day can sometimes take away the pressure of that idea that it has to be a certain number of words or a certain amount of time. Having said that, you know, you can't, you do need to write at some point, but the key thing I've learned from all the really successful writers I've interviewed is that they are writing because they want to. They can't wait to get down and write some more. They're just searching for that time in their schedule all the time. And that's because the passion and the pleasure are there.
Can I build on that just very quickly? I think the key, or something that's worked a lot for me and what I'm hearing in a number of these comments, is getting your subconscious working on the project rather than your conscious mind. So that's why I think the typing works. It's not just producing words, you're starting to think through them, right? You're thinking, you're doing a little rereading, you're taking some notes, you're looking over what you wrote the last time. And then I think then the sentences actually start to form themselves. You don't have to work as hard because the subconscious is better at this. And so I don't believe necessarily in writing every day, but I agree there's like keeping in contact with the project is really helpful, just because then your subconscious is churning away and solving problems for you, like structural problems, argumentative problems, style problems, you name it.
I also
Can I,
want to,
Julia? Oh, I was going to ask you, Julia, but you go ahead and say what you were going to say.
well, I was gonna, we're talking very much about like the person and the writing, but also asking for that feedback and seeking input as part of the process of writing and the finding of joy. If we think about, I mean, I think, you know, when you think about, like, if you think about joy as an act of resistance against despair, or the what you're working on as something that is important, right? That means it's important to share with the world and then get feedback on it. But it's also really important to learn how you receive and how you receive and respond feedback. Just reflecting on that, and some people they take it all in, and then they don't know how to advocate for what they want to do instead of like changing everything, or people who have a hard time accepting criticism because they think it is an attack. So just reflecting on what that experience is like for you, but leveraging your committee, not making everyone do all the work, but thinking about, you know what, that person's an expert in this. I'm going to ask them the questions about that. And that kind of like thinking carefully about who you're asking for feedback at and which points. And Dr. Eliza Kelly at Yale has this wonderful metaphor about keeping it loose. So like when you're putting together a piece of furniture, right? If you nail in the nails too tight, you can't ever unpack it or undo it or change it. You know, so you need to make sure that if it's too tight, no one can give feedback. So keeping it loose and drafty, right? Keeping the bolts loose, the screws a little bit, inviting people into that process at that point can also offer a particular kind of joy, because you're testing out your materials on people, but you're also then making those connections, and that can give people a lot of meaning in the process too. That's not just like sign off on this product, sign off on this chapter, I'm finally done after not talking to anybody for 5 months. I think that it's important that we don't isolate ourselves completely. That's all I was going to say.
You know, similar to that, there was something, Irina, that you said at the very beginning that I really loved. You were talking about writing more as garden writing, which invites people into your work and invites people into your garden. And you said that I'm going to say they might trample on your roses. And I really loved that. But I wonder if you all could comment a bit more about how to get to that point of confidence when you are willing to invite people in to trample on your roses, I suppose. I think as students, it can be really hard to feel that you have that confidence in the work that you're doing and your writing and your research to be able to invite people in to come criticize you, which, we should, build up be a bit tougher and be willing to take criticism. But I don't know, I suppose, how do you get from that point where we are now, where we're really all very beginning? How do we invite people in a way that's helpfully trampling on our roses and not just squashing them?
Can I object to that a little bit, to just one tiny thing you said? I don't think we should all just toughen up all of the time. I'm not sure about that. I think we should take very good care of our creative and intellectual selves. And sometimes that means protecting them from feedback until they're ready for feedback. I think the feedback thing is very tricky. It can be wonderful. And if you have someone who knows how to give you the kind of feedback you need, and you know how to articulate the kind of feedback you need, and you've developed some trust, it can be beautiful. I just had that experience and it was like life-changing for me a few weeks ago, basically. But I've also had really terrible experiences with people who don't know how to give feedback. And it just is so damaging. I think that part of us that creates is really tender. And I don't think we should just harden up. I think that's the fortress, right? Like, I'm just going to take it, the arrows will come. So that's one thing. And then also with the garden, I was really thinking in terms of academic versus more public or creative writing. And they're not in the sense of inviting criticism. People will criticize whether you invite them or not, right? But in the sense of letting people make some of the connections, not, I think in academic writing, we strive for precision and logic, and everything has to be super clear. And that's part of the beauty of that writing. But when we step out into other forms, we can leave some gaps. Verlin Klinkenborg has a great book about this. It's something like Something Sentences About Writing. And he talks about how you don't have to like put every sentence in connection to the last sentence. You can leave a little gap between the sentences and let your reader fill it in. Or you could do that in the narrative, or, you don't have to sort of I think that's the beauty of writing that's not academic. But in academic writing, you want to do that. You want to actually make everything kind of really clear and logical and precise a lot of the time.
I think that I love all that what you just said. I think that one thing we can do to help us with criticism is having other people in our corner. That's where other people come in. So having a supportive community. We will still meet the nasty critics, the anonymous critics, the supervisor who just doesn't quite have enough time and gives you something kind of thoughtless or whatever else. All those things will happen. And of course, we can be mindful, moving into your own academic careers, you can be mindful of not being that person. But we can also be mindful of each other and making sure that we have support groups. And that may include supporting risk and resilience. I once talked to a woman who told me that she and her husband were both academics, and that they had a thing where if one of them got something rejected, the other one had to take them out to dinner. So they weren't doing the classic thing of supporting success. They were supporting failure, which is brilliant when you think about it, because it just means you're going to send more stuff out, because either you're going to end up with another article or grant or whatever, or you're going to get taken out to dinner. So, having other people around you where you have that kind of pact of supporting each other. But the other thing is it is experience. And, when Inger Mubern, the Thesis Whisperer, if you don't know the Thesis Whisperer blog, it's brilliant, thesiswhisperer.com. And she talks about what she calls the valley of shit. And she says, there's always going to be in any project, certainly in anything as big as a dissertation or a book, there's always going to be that time when you're just in the valley of shit. What do? Well, you keep your eye on the mountains. You have your friends around, your posse to help you out if you can. And in my case, when I was in the valley of shit with this book, and it was more than once, I tell you, I even have a picture in there of me in an imagined mud bath, just sort of like sinking in the mud of all the references and everything. but you're able to say, I've done this before. I'll probably get through this again. With your dissertation, you probably can't say that, but you can say, oh, a lot of other people have done it before. Chances are I'll get there too. And then that will help you moving forward.
Bruce, I'm gonna let you have the last word, and then we unfortunately do have to wrap up, which is not
Yeah.
ideal because this conversation is so stimulating, but
No, Helen, what you said was so beautifully put. And just bringing all of this together makes me think of one of my favorite books in recent years, that is Rebecca Solnit, Orwell's Roses.
Just read
Um,
that.
and it's a book about, about basically gardening, and he invited people into his garden, but he invited himself into gardens all over, and his love of roses. But it's about, writing in the midst of despair. But it's also about hobbies. And I think, writing can be a very intense, isolating, creative practice, no matter what kind of writing you do. And I think having some kind of hobby too that gets your head outside of it, that whether it's, a new kind of cooking, or, I was a musician. I know Irina's needles. I was a musician in college and was despairing when I gave up clarinet. And it was only when I just thought, what am I going to do with my life, even though I was in graduate school without music. And I just went out one day and bought a guitar and have never looked back. And I just think that kind of immersion in something that gets your creative mind completely away from writing for a little while can really help.
Well, that's as good a place as any, I think, to wrap up. Thank you again, Julia, Helen, Irina, and Bruce, for your time and also your generosity in your comments. Some of them have, been quite personal. I think we've peeked behind the curtain a little bit today, and I think our audience really appreciates that. Thank you, Lauren and Chris, for all of the logistical support. And the theme of writing with other people and finding your people, as we've literally just touched on it. So in that vein, I just want to remind about part 2, our collective writing hour happening on February 18th. The link to register for that is in the chat. And Lauren, if I'm not missing anything, we'll say good morning / good night, good afternoon, and reconvene in some other space. Thanks again, everyone, for being here.
Happy writing.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you,
for
everyone.
having us.